Kinjekitile Ngwale was a Tanzanian prophet, or if you like, you can call him a seer, and he was a leader of the 1905 Maji Maji rebellion against colonial rule in German East Africa, which is now known as Tanzania. Kinjekitile was born in what is now Tanzania, and he was relatively unknown, and it is said that he disappeared from his home only to return a few days later, stating that he had been possessed by a spirit that took the form of a snake. Kinjekitile encouraged his followers to overlook tribal differences and unite against the Germans. He told his followers that their ancestors had commanded him to lead a rebellion against German colonial. Kinjekitile's people were increasingly getting tired of German colonial rule. Why? Well, for one, the people of southern Tanganyika were being forced to grow cotton, all the while receiving very little income for it. The people of southern Tanganyika also had lost a lot of their lands to the Germans. And German mercenaries were busy raping their wives and the daughters of the people of Tanganyika. Kinjekitile then told the people that he would give them holy water that would protect them from German bullets. This holy water would be gotten from River Rufiji, and it would be mixed with millet, sorghum, and local herbs, which would give immunity to the German bullets. Once applied, the bullets from the enemy would drop off without harming them. And another legend states that the water had the power to turn bullets into water. The people began to uproot cotton, and as the rebellion gained momentum, government officials began to be killed. The people of southern Tanganyika believed they would finally be able to fight off this gang of German invaders and finally get their freedom. However, that was not the case, because the German colonizers fought them fearlessly. More than 75,000 Maji Maji warriors were killed. Kinjekitile himself didn't get to see all the action that came from the rebellion that he had inspired, and he was hanged on August 4th, 1905. Nevertheless, even though they didn't really win this rebellion, the Maji Maji rebellion was a source of inspiration for future nationalists like Julius Nyerere. He was a Kenyan freedom fighter who led a battalion of fighters from his Kisii tribe in resisting British colonization. The British later killed him, beheaded him, and took his head to Britain. This is his story. Otenyo Nyamaterere. In the late 19th century, early 20th century, the British began to raid and take what they considered their territory in parts of Kenya. Being drunk with power, the British wanted to take more and more land, and in fact, they began to take more and more land. They began to take livestock and food from the native people of Kenya, and all this was done in a very violent manner. In 1905, British officers arrived in Gusiland. 3 years later, Northcote, a young British official who had risen in the ranks, was sent to Kisii. The British military killed several of the locals and warriors and made away with close to 8,000 livestock. But in their raid, luckily, Otenyo survived. Otenyo justifiably was extremely angry at the inhumane actions of the British, and he planned a counter-attack on the British people. Otenyo assembled seasoned warriors and came up with a plan. The plan was to use a different route and get ahead of the British officers who were moving slowly with the stolen livestock. Though armed with inferior weapons, the Kisii warriors managed to lay an ambush on the British and recovered many livestock. But that was not enough for brave Otenyo. He wanted Northcote dead. It is said that he hid between bushes, waiting patiently for Northcote to pass by with his men. Otenyo ambushed Northcote when he was in good view, and before the Mzungu officer could get his gun out, Otenyo flung his spear, which hit Northcote right on his shoulder. Northcote fell to the ground in utter pain, bleeding and cursing Otenyo, while the warrior laughed in his face and ran off into hiding. Northcote was severely injured and was thought dead. And so what did the British Army do? They retaliated. Some reports state that the colonial government forced Mora, who was Otenyo's aunt, to use her influence to stop the war. She assembled the elders and convinced them to work with the colonial government. And it is said that the elders then tricked Otenyo, who was still in hiding, and handed him to the Wazungu colonizers. Otenyo was tried in public and executed by a firing squad at the Kisii Stadium. His head was later cut off and sent off to Britain, while his body was found beside a bridge with many gunshot wounds. Under the guidance of the Gusii elders, Otenyo's headless body was buried. The legend of Otenyo and the story of Northcote is still retold today in songs and poems recited among the Kisii people of Kenya. Chief Mkwawa was an anti-colonial Tanzanian hero from the Heihei tribe who led the Heihei rebellion against German colonial invaders. Chief Mkwawa came to power in 1878 after succeeding his father Munyigumba. His name means conqueror of many lands because Mkwawa was able to win wars against the Ngoni and the cattle-raiding Maasai. Mkwawa began to clash with the invading Germans because they were a stumbling block to his expansionist plans. Mkwawa was also fearlessly independent and proud, and he did not want his people to be subjugated by the colonial Germans. He also fought the Germans because they were stealing Heihei lands and introducing forced labor. In July 1891, the German commissioner Emil von Zelewski led a battalion of soldiers, about 320 officers, to suppress the Heihei. On 17th August, they were attacked by Mkwawa's 3,000-strong army at Lugalo, who quickly overpowered the German force and killed Zelewski. On 28th October 1894, the Germans under the new commissioner, Colonel Freiherr Friedrich von Schell, attacked Mkwawa's fortress, and although they took the fort, Mkwawa managed to escape. After this, the Germans relaxed their machinery against Mkwawa, thinking that this had completely weakened him, but they were sorely mistaken. Mkwawa conducted a campaign of guerrilla warfare, harassing the Germans in their controlled areas. The Germans then adopted a scorched earth policy, which is a military strategy of burning or destroying crops and other resources. This confrontation between the Germans and the Heihei came to an end in 1898, when on 19th July, Chief Mkwawa was surrounded by the Germans. In his fiercely independent nature, he refused to be captured alive, and he shot himself and died. The Germans later took his skull, which was kept in a museum, until its return in 1954. There is a large rock in Tanzania which is called Gangilonga Rock, which is a sacred shrine for the Wahehe, where their ancestors would communicate with their supreme being to gain wisdom and to gain knowledge. And it is said that it is on this very rock that Chief Mkwawa meditated and where he learned that the Germans were after him. Thanks to Chief Mkwawa and the Heihei, other revolts against the Germans happened later. For example, the Maji Maji rebellion of 1905. Chief Awitch ascended the throne after the assassination of his father in 1886. By the time he came to power, the British were busy extending their rule in northern Uganda. While other chiefs were busy signing treaties with the British, Chief Awitch was doing the opposite. He was not about to roll the red carpet for the invaders. The British hatred for him increased when he gave asylum to Kabalega and his fugitives. Kabalega was a king of the Bunyoro Kitara kingdom, which severely opposed British rule. In 1898, following a series of military incursions by Chief Awitch and his fearless army into Acholi territory under British protection, a Major Herman set out to face Awitch in battle with an army comprising mainly Nubian and Baganda mercenaries. Awitch held off this British onslaught until 1901 when he was captured. While in prison, his people continued to revolt and they continually demanded for his return. He was released in 1902 as the British pestered him continually to accept their rule. In January 1912, he was accused of amassing guns from the Arabs, and the British began to demand a gun tax, which Chief Awitch passionately refused to pay. And he passionately encouraged his warriors not to pay it as well. Chief Awitch continued resisting British rule, and eventually his team of freedom fighters killed a Captain Turner. The chief and his fighters sought refuge at the Lamogi Hills cave as the British army continued pursuing them. The British deployed poisonous gases in the caves, and finally Chief Awitch and his warriors had to get out of the caves in the Lamogi Hills. Chief Awitch was then captured and exiled, but he was released later in 1919. Chief Awitch is regarded as a national hero for refusing to collaborate with the British invaders.